So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today.
The treason of Christians and of the church, according to Jacques Ellul, was to settle in, to wait contentedly for something for which one hoped less and less, to organize so as to wait as comfortably as possible, and finally no longer to expect anything at all, but to put oneself to sleep in the feverish activity of organizing society, the world, the economy, and of discovering science." Unquote. We have stopped waiting, which is the only context in which hope makes sense. We have become feverishly active in good things. But it's the type of fever which puts us to sleep, or at least asleep according to regarding the one important thing, waiting for God to return again, to speak again, to end this time of abandonment. My name is Lowell Bliss. Welcome to episode 53 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. Let me warn you, this is going to be a longer than normal episode, in part because it is our last one, our last regular episode in our year-long video series on hope. It will also be long because what Ellul has to say about waiting as part of the threefold decision for hope is complicated. Right when you're about to be freaked out by how radical he intends the waiting to be, he slips in a qualifier. But then before you can deeply exhale your sigh of relief, he qualifies his qualifier. Let's at least start with a summary, and then we'll look at two different examples of people who wait in hope, examples that Ellul himself supplies. Here's my summary of what I think Ellul is saying. Don't work for the revolution. Don't trust that the revolution, whatever version of it is popular at the moment, will bring in the kingdom of God. Instead, wait with perseverance for the only revolution that matters, the one where God changes his mind and decides to show up again, where God begins to speak again. Does this mean that you forego work altogether? This has huge implications for a missionary and a climate activist like myself, someone who has inherited my dad's workaholism to an unhealthy extent. Does this mean that we forego work altogether? Here are 5 answers from Ellul summarized here. Number 1, who said waiting isn't work? In fact, it will be the hardest work that you ever have to do. Number 2, your friends, both inside and outside the church, will interpret your waiting as not working, accusing you of laziness, of abandoning the cause, of not carrying your fair load. Resisting their shame and their pull will be one of the most grueling struggles you will have to endure. Number 3, yes, it does mean that we forego work altogether, if that is how the Lord calls you in the moment, or if that's the only way you can get the messages across to your habituated self, or to a society addicted to activities and revolutions. It's prophetic in that case to not work. Number 4, actually you don't stop working, but you reprioritize it behind waiting. Ellul writes, the first step is to take note of the impotence and the futility of our so-called revolutions, that the effective fundamental attitude is another one, waiting, which will be translated into involvement secondarily. Unquote. Number 5, you keep working, but you detach work from any cause and effect relationship with the kingdom of God. Ellul argues that only waiting with prayer and realism are decisive in bringing about the kingdom of God. What's the point of working then? Well, because some actions and activities are what Wendell calls right action. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it because certain acts of work can be acts of love. But now faith, hope, love abide these 3, but the greatest of these is love. That's 1 Corinthians 13:13. One day faith will become sight. hope will become realized. Love, however, has an eternal existence. So make your work a function of love, not of hope. When I think of Christians waiting for the Lord's return with the degree of intensity that Ellul seems to prescribe, I think about those end-times prophecy nuts who regularly pop up. They and their followers sell all their possessions except for their white robes and trumpets and wristwatches, it seems. They camp out at the highest comfortable elevation. A couple months ago, I was in a used bookstore in St. Catharines, Ontario, and I spotted a copy of the book 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988 by Edgar Whisenant. My first thought was, I remember when that book was published. Then my second thought was, why would anyone in 2018 possibly want to buy that book? But actually I wanted to as a cultural artifact, I suppose. Jacques Ellul calls these sects the Illuminati. And he writes, quote, "It is indeed true that these people, burning with hopes and fixated in a fierce expectation, do not provide us with the trustworthy model of the Christian life. They are psychics," he says. Yet, he continues, qualifying his qualifier, there are a number of elements in their attitude which should be noted. One thing is precisely this hope, this rigor of waiting, the absolute fixation on the return. Here, in spite of everything that can be said, they are right. They are the ones who are teaching all the churches a lesson. We know full well that heretics have always put a finger on some truths of God that the church had neglected. Unquote. Okay, so if we give the Illuminati their due, what then is their particular error, and how can that help us know what waiting is not? Two things. First, waiting is not a sprint. It isn't even a marathon measured at a precise 26 miles, 385 yards. It is instead a long race where the finish line is indeterminate. Quote, "But why do they, the Illuminati, act that way? And why are they forever making new starts?" Ellul asks. It is precisely because they do not have perseverance. They live in that fervor and in that rigorous waiting for a while. They give themselves a time limit, 1 year, 3 years of gripping, all-absorbing waiting, and then it is all over. One can live a year in such a high degree of tension, say 1988, but not a whole life. Again, it is possible for a person to remain in a state of exaltation as long as he knows it is going to end on a certain date. But he cannot keep that up on an indefinite basis. It is like a runner in a race who sprints for 10 yards because he knows they are the last 10 yards. It is an indefinite waiting, Ellul says, an inexhaustible perseverance. And listen what Ellul says about perseverance. Perseverance, as a quality of waiting, is one of the intangible aspects of hope. It is hope's response to failure and suffering. It is constancy in the inner life, and it is action in the face of appearances to the contrary, in spite of the refutations thrown at us by facts and events, by the state, by science, by technology, by history, by all the gods. Ellul also writes, perseverance never counts on success, on a possible outcome. It is not because the situation might get better that one keeps on going. To the contrary, perseverance completely repudiates all the success criteria of action. Unquote. Ellul argues that perseverance is our bulwark against what can devolve into laziness, to a lackadaisical attitude, to mere waiting without doing anything. Unquote. He writes, perseverance is just the attitude by which we continue to act with maximum earnestness and down-to-earth devotion, in spite of the absence of temporal effect, because there is no cause and effect relation between our acts and the kingdom of God. Perseverance teaches us not to attach importance to our failures, because the important thing for us is Jesus Christ. Through perseverance, the failures cease to be sources of upset and despair, for it persuades us that failure is a necessary part of the Christian life. Through the disengagement, he explains, between the immediate objective of the action and its true ultimate. The second mistake that the Illuminati make is that they invest all their waiting into a single event, the Lord's bodily return and his second coming, and close their imagination to all the ways that the Lord wants to show up before that glorious day, ways that God might speak now and into this current epoch of abandonment. I have to confess that I've not been able to get a handle on Ellul's eschatology. I think I need to read him more widely than just this book. Nonetheless, I feel confident in saying that while Ellul would have us anchor our hope and focus our waiting on the ultimate eschaton, those same longings and those same promises and those same dynamics can apply to any period where we discern that it is a time of abandonment from God, a time when God is not speaking. Earlier in this series, I've spoken about how while the kingdom of God has been inaugurated in the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, it will only be consummated at his second coming. We live in this period of the now and the not yet. Nonetheless, we can wait for and long for and pray for what I call serious incursions of the kingdom of God in the here and now. That's another reason why Job is such a good example of waiting, and why Job, our second example, is Ellul's primary example in this chapter. Job, pre-patriarchal as his story is, was not waiting for the second coming of Jesus Christ. For that matter, he wasn't even waiting for the first coming, as were Simeon and Anna in the Nativity story. Job was waiting for God to stop his season of abandonment. Here we will get some of our clearest statements about what waiting is. Ellul writes, "Faced with the pressing tasks to which we are summoned by the world's ferment, by the urgency of the situations and the decisions to be made, in short, by the present human misery, the solution for which cannot be put off until tomorrow, hope certifies to the fact that commitment in the immediate and the current is nonsense. It tells us that the first step is to take note of the impotence and the futility of our so-called revolutions, that the effective fundamental attitude is another one, which will be translated into involvement secondarily. The person of hope is the person who waits, and with a pessimistic waiting for nothing, normally nothing should happen, Ellul says. The only thing we can reckon on is frustration and derision," he continues. "How could it be otherwise in God's silence? Job waits, and his friends never tire of proving that this is absurd, which it is, that Job is wrong, which he is, that God will not come, which is true. They take pains to explain to Job why God will not come. Job is guilty. And to make fun of him, since his attitude either is one of godless rebellion or of an absurd expectation. Still, Job waits," unquote. Ellul calls Job the one in whom the fullness of waiting is actualized. Job's whole life is filled with waiting. He never lets himself be diverted to the right or to the left by his own attempts to transform the situation. He is penetrated to the bottom of the problem with lucidity. He knows that in the last analysis, it is an affair between God and himself. That all the rest, the things that happen, are only the outward aspect of that quarrel with God. He does not work hard and courageously to recover his riches. He does not set out in pursuit of the brigands or the foreign soldiers in an attempt to get back his oxen and his camels. Job rejects all those human reactions because he knows that the root of the problem is not there. Nothing of serious consequence can be done until satisfaction is had from God. He leaves activity and work to one side, since the one important thing is to wait for God." Unquote. The person who waits never lets himself be diverted to the right or the left by his own attempts to transform the situation. And the person who waits rejects all those human reactions because he knows that the root of the problem is not there. Well, where then is the root of the problem? In Job's story, the root of the problem is not in the bad storm that collapsed the house and killed his progeny. The root of the problem is not in the marauding thieves that stole his livestock. The root of the problem is that God has momentarily abandoned him. We, the reader, know the larger backstory of Satan's audience with God, and we know that this is absolutely true. Job has been abandoned. Jacques Ellul therefore contends that nothing of serious consequence in Job's story can be done until satisfaction is had from God. So let's close out this episode by returning to the Illuminati, because Ellul himself lets them have the last say. Sure, good rational Christians show, quote, no hesitation in calling these poor fools heretics. But then Ellul writes, however mistaken their concepts and interpretations may be, the Illuminati, like the Pietists, have been arousers of the church, discoverers of a new hope for each generation. They, and not the theologians, are the ones who have set the church ahead. Jehoiachim of Florus, Munzer, Peter Waldo, John of Leyden, examples, renewed for the church the decisive tension toward the coming of the kingdom. Without waiting, revived by these exalted ones, there is no more to Christian life but church. There is no hope, only words. Unquote. As mentioned in the introduction, today marks our final regular episode of this year-long video series on hope for the Liberator today. I had planned to end at an even 52 episodes, a full year's worth of weekly video logs. Instead, we got into Jacques Ellul's threefold decision for hope, namely decisions of prayer, realism, and waiting. So here we are, episode 53. It's fitting, I suppose. Hope and waiting never fit into a nice, neat package, and certainly not one defined by such an arbitrary thing as time. Next week, my wife Robin and I will set up the camera, and she will interview me in a leisurely retrospective, a summary of sorts about what we've learned over the past year. 53 opportunities to live for a while with Jacques Ellul, Chief Plenty-Coups, Walter Brueggemann, so many other skilled practitioners of hope. I'm Lowell Bliss, Christian environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.